I would consider the use of uranium in non-fissile penetrating weapons and bunker busters, whether they contain high explosives or not, to be effectively a nuclear weapon. I'm Ted Weman. I am the Deputy Director of the Iranian Medical Research Center, which is a medical and scientific research organization, non-profit, voluntary organization in Canada and the U.S. We're opening up offices also in London, and I have been involved in uranium contamination research since the mid-90s, following Gulf War I, when I began working with Dr. Asif Durakovic to conduct studies of the possible inhalation of uranium in veterans, Canadian, U.S. and British veterans at that time. It's known, even if it's known secretly, so to speak, or let's say quietly or tacitly on a worldwide scale, that these things have got long-term implications no one wants to face. If you don't have a moral objection, you might have a pragmatic objection, which might be the liabilities that a nation faces for permanently contaminating another nation's environment. Saddam Hussein was a short-lived event, but uranium contamination in Iraq will last for millions of years. So the liabilities are very significant when you have veterans and civilians of every nation that participated being contaminated, or every nation that was in the receiving end, or every nation that was in the sending end are contaminated. So it's a matter of time before the United States, Britain, Australia, Canada become accountable for their own veterans' poor health and the contamination. Will they ever become accountable for what they have done to Iraqi civilians, or Bosnian or Serbian civilians, or Japanese or Puerto Rican civilians where they've tested these weapons? I'm not sure, but certainly there's that's the issue. If they don't have a moral objection, then they need maybe to get a more pragmatic concern, because I think they'll see more and more effort on an international scale, particularly through the UN, to find these organizations, or find these countries who have deployed these weapons liable through the UN. Now, who has the weight in the UN? Who controls the Security Council? Maybe one country or two countries can sustain the recognition of their liability and maybe not actually be found to be guilty. I don't know.
Who went to Afghanistan and also to Iraq to collect, to do the public health surveys, which we did in the communities where bombing occurred, and also to collect various specimens that were analyzed in the lab. We collected urine specimens, because uranium is excreted in the urine, and you can tell what it is and how much there is. And you can do some mathematical extrapolation to determine the quantities that are in the body. We also collect water and soil samples. And in some cases we collected clothing samples, because clothing itself was contaminated, pieces of metal which may have been uranium or fused with uranium. And we do this work predominantly by using field equipment to identify it, and also a series of interviews which narrows down to people to who was in the right place at the right time, or really who was in the wrong place at the right time, to see who was most likely exposed. The upper left-hand corner is Iraq, and that's Dr. Shakely, who works at the American University in Beirut, who traveled with me in Iraq. On the right is a bunker buster target. Actually, that's a radio station in downtown Kabul in Afghanistan. The boys on the left are in a little town called Bibi Mahro, which is the most severely contaminated location I've ever seen in any of my studies or any of my fieldwork. And on the right is quite a well-known photograph. It is a particle actually of plutonium, which in lung tissue. And that you can see those, it's actually a star pattern in the center there with tracks shooting off to it. And those are tracks of alpha emissions, or what's called alpha particles, which are essentially the radioactive particles that are emitted from uranium, and in this case plutonium, identical. They're identical in plutonium and uranium, showing the tracks through the surrounding cells in the tissue. Just a brief on UMRC. We are really the only organization in the world that is operating independently to do this work, where we collect these various types of specimens and samples, both human and geological. We analyze those in laboratories around the world, and then we take them to scientific conferences, the results of that work, and we get that work peer-reviewed. Those of you who have a university background would know you have to peer-review your work. At that point, if we get peer-reviewed successfully, then we submit our material for publication.
The DU penetrators are conventional. We call them conventional or battlefield weapons. As opposed to a fissile or nuclear explosive weapon that was used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and so on. So those nuclear weapons are called strategic. Fissile weapons, DU rounds and bunker busters using uranium are tactical or conventional because they're used in more battlefield circumstances as opposed to massive like a fissile weapon like Nagasaki or Hiroshima destroys an entire city. But a conventional weapon is used predominantly from military to military, militaries targeting other militaries. That's typically what the definition is. Although we must say that they are classed as weapons of indiscriminate effect. In fact, in that the UN designation, depleted uranium and uranium weapons have indiscriminate effects. They used in battlefields, used during wartime, conventional war, but they have long-term indiscriminate effects in that they remain in the environment for a long time, and they affect civilians, not just other soldiers. You know.
Okay, I think the thing that's important to talk about here, and people have lots of questions, but is how does this contamination actually occur? And largely it's through inhalation. And if you saw those pictures of the tanks being hit by the DU penetrators, those were non-explosive rounds. Think of that. You saw those great explosions on those tanks when those rounds came? They're non-explosive. In other words, there's no chemical explosive material in those rounds. These penetrators, the material that they're made out of is a metal, uranium metal, that has a really two interesting characteristics. Actually has three interesting characteristics. It is extremely ductile. And ductile means that it deforms but will come back to its shape. When you break it, it likes to hold its shape. It's not fragile. It doesn't break easily, and it will. The second characteristic. Now that's unusual for a very dense metal like tungsten, which is one of the alternatives to uranium, is not ductile. Tungsten shatters. Uranium doesn't. It will deform, but it will hold its integrity into same as a rod. So a long rod is fired. Those rods are anywhere from the size of a pencil up to about this long. When they hit the target, this is where the truly interesting characteristics show, is it has a feature called adiabatic shearing, in which when the penetrator hits the point of impact, you would think it would go blunt on the point, like tungsten does or like lead would. It doesn't. It actually gets sharper. And if you know about flint, working with flint to make flint like arrowheads and so on, if you hit it the right way, flint actually gets sharper. That's what uranium does. It actually sharpens on impact. So it hits a tank or a concrete wall. Won't tell you what it does to the human body because it's amazing. I've seen pictures of it. But if you hit a tank or a concrete wall, the point at 1.5 to 2 kilometers a second, it's 1.5 miles a second. That's the rate at which it hits. The size of a pencil, or up to about 2 inches in diameter, depending upon the type. It actually gets sharper as it penetrates. It doesn't break through. It actually causes a process called a plasma transformation, or a phase change in the metal that it hits, or the material that it hits, and it parts the atomic structure of the tank and goes through it and leaves an unusually clean, symmetrical hole, which is identical from the front and the back, continues to sharpen itself on the way through, but it erodes at the same time, and this is the third characteristic. That erosion releases a dust or particulate matter which fills the air in high concentrations, and that instantly, because uranium is auto-igniting, you don't need it, there's no fire, there's no explosive, it's just metal on metal or metal on concrete. Immediately that bursts into a kind of a gas cloud explosion, or a poof, like poof. So what you saw in those pictures in that film, some of those weren't uranium penetrators, but some of them were. The ones that had sparking, where you saw the sparks shooting out in all directions, like in 3D, that's the uranium instantly igniting in small particles and fine pieces of metal going off in all directions. So those three qualities, self-sharpening, auto-igniting, and what was the other one? I can't remember now. Are why it's preferred to any other material. But so the problem here is that it aerosolizes. And the aerosols are anywhere from 1/millionth of a yard in diameter down to 100 to 1,000 smaller of an inch smaller than that again. So down to 1/billionth. And they're extremely small. They're impossible to see once they aerosolize, once they burn and become powder and they burn, you can't see them anymore. You could see maybe a fine film on top of a white piece of paper. Or if there was enough of it, you might see actually a millimeter or a quarter of an inch of dust. And those particles are in the air for a long time, in the immediate air, and they work like if you know anything about gas clouds, they really operate according to the principles of hydrodynamics, not aerodynamics. They work like a type of fluid. And they saturate the air. They travel equalize themselves in the air in all directions, up, out, and around. And they will transport indefinitely for months to years at altitudes of 10 to 20,000 feet eventually. And frankly, people don't believe this. This is what the Canadian military told us. Those guys that you tested could not possibly have been contaminated by inhaling uranium because they were 80 kilometers or 50 miles from the point that uranium was used. Well, the stuff travels 10,000 kilometers or 6,000 miles without any difficulty. And the dust from the Sahara Desert is found in the coral reefs off the coast of the Bahamas, and grasshoppers blowing out of the storms in Africa, dust storms in Africa, have been found landing alive on the east coast of the United States. Wheat germ blowing in the dust out of Ohio State has been found in the upper floors of the Empire State Building, around the edges of the window, embedded, is caught in the cracks. This stuff, just like in the uranium weapons testing in the 50s and 60s, fills the upper atmosphere and it goes everywhere. And it transports itself around the globe. So it's the inhalation is the issue. Now, one of the arguments the government tries to make on this is, well, if the concentrations are low. Well, that's not really the issue, because if you saw one particle can damage cells. The origins of the leukemia, the origins of the various cancers and deformations that you saw there, the origins of the problems I have, and some of you met Doug Rocky, are because we inhaled uranium, because that compromised our cells, created neurological problems, created problems with our respiratory system. You can hear my respiratory problems. I still have them. I was a smoker, but I've quit quite a long time ago. I have headaches. I have night sweats. I have hot rushes, hot flashes, like I'm menopausal, and I have that regularly. I have periods 2-3 months at a time where I'm very lethargic, have no energy, and I'm a pretty energetic person. And I don't have it bad. I have about 6 to 8 times normal levels in my body of uranium than I should have. People like Doug Rocky or the people that were shown here, their levels are much higher than mine.
This U.S. Army training video is based on a manual that was written before the Gulf War in 1991. The manual was never distributed.
Heavy metal toxicity may occur if depleted uranium enters the body through open wounds, inhalation, or ingestion. Depleted uranium dust or smoke may be inhaled if respiratory protection is not worn. It may also be picked up and ingested if gloves are not worn, and the dust is not washed off before eating, drinking, or using the latrine, or unstable munitions should be marked, secured, reported, and left for specially trained recovery retrograde teams.
The dangers of DU have been known for 20 years, but the military continues to use them and ignore or silence its critics.
The troops are misinformed before going into war, and veterans are misinformed when they return. Now, the misinformation comes obviously in 2 ways. One is warning people ahead of time about what they might be facing. Uranium contamination is kind of nondescript. A bullet is pretty descript. I'm scared if someone's going to blow me up or shoot me. I'm not so scared about the innocuous dust that is somewhere in the background that may or may not hurt me. So it's easy to play upon that ignorance. And the military does not warn its troops sufficiently. It doesn't acknowledge that it's dangerous. Therefore, why should it warn them? If you do not take a position that uranium, low-level emitters like uranium, low-level radioactive emitters like uranium are poisonous, then why would you warn anybody to protect themselves from it? Secondly, if I warn you, and then you are exposed, and I'm in control of you, and then you come back and you're sick, or you get sick, or you have offspring that are deformed, I'm liable. Therefore, I can't tell you because I carry liability. Now, in the United States, there are laws to protect the government from being sued. But if I state a liability, then I'm liable. So I can't tell you that. And the other way that people are kept in the dark, that veterans are kept in the dark, is that when they do come back, the government says we have programs that will test you, we will analyze your body parts and your urine, and we'll let you know whether you're contaminated. And as you saw in the film we watched tonight, as Dr. Drakovich was saying, the methodologies being used to do the analysis to determine contamination are not accurate, they're not correct, they're improper, and they don't do the right approach, they don't use the right chemistry and the right physics. Therefore, they cannot say one way or another whether the people they've allegedly evaluated have been exposed or not. It's just not possible.
This is Baghdad Gate. You see the black on the tree and down here on the ground? It's not carbon. It's uranium dust. It's where uranium burned in the air. When it hit that tank that was in the hole here down there, you see those, there's actually, right here. Those were where the tank was buried in the dirt and dug in. And the tank was hit coming from the gate, probably from a helicopter, and it was hit here. It burst into flame, and the uranium oxidized when it blew, and it burnt this tree and all of the ground there. So that's not actually carbon, that's oxidized uranium. This is a vest that was being worn by one of the Iraqi tank crew. That vest was more contaminated than the ground, and that's interesting. Now, it's made out of cotton. This vest is in a plastic bag, and in the lab that you saw in the film. Now, this vest is made out of cotton, and this was a very interesting finding because this was just lying in a field of maybe 1,000 meters from where the tank was. Somebody brought it over and said, in fact, it was Dr. Shakely, why don't you check this? I would never have imagined to actually put a Geiger counter to a piece of fabric lying in a field. I was looking for discolored materials, metal, that kind of thing. And that was about 300 times over the oxide, the radioactivity level of the oxides that were on the ground where the tank was hit. And this confirmed for us something that people had been speculating since Gulf War I, is that there is an attraction of this minute dust into certain types of fabric. And some wives and children, in Gulf War I in particular, U.S. veterans' wives and children, Canadian wives and children, vets' wives and children, were reported to have gotten ill and actually measured with high levels of contamination of uranium, and they're shown in their urine after their husbands returned from Gulf War I. And nobody could understand why. Well, this is the answer. They came home with their kits with dirty clothes. The wives immediately shook out their pants, their jackets, hung stuff up, put it through the washing machine. Now, you can wash this thing 5-6 times and it does not remove the uranium in it. There's some feature of uranium's, the particle's attraction to the fabric. It's actually been noted in the nuclear sector. That's why they have an issue with clothing. Okay, this is a famous shot, obviously Afghanistan, Mazar-i-Sharif. This was a bunker buster there. If you remember, about a week into this operation in Iraqi freedom, a dust storm stopped the troops in their tracks for about 48 hours, 72 hours. This is a picture of a Hummer in that storm just north of Basra. This air is obviously fully contaminated because not just from Gulf War II, but from Gulf War I. And Basra remains contaminated now since 1991. Okay, let's go on. That dust storm photograph can be seen on the internet if you, at the NASA's aeronautical photographs or satellite photos of the area. This was taken about 4 days into the most recent Gulf War.
The quantities are never really correct. There are official quantities in Gulf War II or Operation Iraqi Freedom. Our estimates are quite different. The official quantities are about the DU fired from the Warthog, the Thunderbolt A-10, and from some 120 millimeter shells, and also from the Apache helicopter and the Bradley fighting vehicle. And that also includes the Challenger tank, the British Challenger tank, and the Australian Challenger. And they have also some fighting vehicles that fire these rounds. But that doesn't account for any of the uranium that was used in the bunker busters and the high altitude bombs that were dropped, the precision guided bombs, which came in from the B-52s, this is the B-51s that flew from Florida, dropped their bombs in one night and then returned to the U.S. the same night. None of these were or from Germany or from England. None of those bombs have been talked about. Our estimates are about 2,000 tons of uranium was deployed in Operation Iraqi Freedom. So we're looking, what's that, maybe 4 times what we think was used in the first Gulf War. Our estimates, so that's pretty high. Now, when uranium contamination occurs by inhaling aerosolized metallic ceramic uranium, as you call it, those particles are very small. You don't need too many. One particle can cause a problem in a cell if it's next to it by releasing alpha emissions that will slice through the DNA and damage the genetic materials in the cell. So if you look at the number of particles at those levels of 0.1 micron size in, say, a 5 kilogram or a 10-pound weapon, you're looking at hundreds of billions to trillions or quadrillions of particles in the air from one of those weapons. So if you aerosolize that one of those, if you aerosolize 1,000 or 2,000 tons of that, it's an uncountable number of small particles are transported by the wind and resuspended by mechanical action, lifted up into the higher atmosphere and moved around globally. So it's a physics calculation. How many particles can come out of that many tons, and how many will remain suspended and be resuspended and blown around in the atmosphere to be inhaled by somebody? It's It's uncountable numbers. It certainly isn't a few miles or a few kilometers. It's thousands to tens of thousands of miles that this material travels, and because of the physics of the lift in the air of a small particle, they can remain aloft for months to years at a time.
But we've had four trips to Afghanistan, and then the one trip to Iraq. Can't go back to Iraq, obviously, for obvious reasons. And every time we've collected materials, which we've published and so on. This is just a sample of some of, just so you see what we're doing. 203 down here, undiagnosed illness and radioactive warfare. That's a paper by Dr. Dirac. We have quantitative analysis of uranium isotopes in the urine of civilian population. See, you can see these are pretty technical. They're largely showing the data findings that we have. You just can't find this kind of scientific information anywhere else except through our work and where it gets published. The famous silver bullet, the 120 millimeter anti-tank round. This on the left. And on the right is the impact of it. On the left is a picture of what happens. And these are called sabot rounds, a small, a narrow, a 3/4 inch rod, about 18 inches long. It's fired from a tank. They have a sabot around it which allows it to fill the barrel, and when it leaves the barrel, the sabot breaks off or drops off, and that rod continues on. You see down it said on the bottom just 1.5 kg of TNT. So one rod, the impact of one rod is equivalent about the explosion of 1.5 kilograms. That's just the impact. Remember, there's no explosive here. These are just examples. I think this is the same pen that's in the picture, or a pen of the same make. Now, here, this begins now to show begins the mystery. Because this picture, you see how big this pen is? My hand? It's exactly the same make of pen. You see, how big would you guess that hole is in diameter? It's 2 to 2.5, 2 3/4 inches. There is no depleted uranium officially in the U.S. or British arsenal with 2.5 to 2 3/4 inches diameter. It's non-existent. There's no such thing exists. The 30 millimeter famous one, which is what the warthogs, you know, the tank busters, those ones that come down, they strafe down. You saw pictures in the film. Their penetrator is the diameter of this pin. That's about 1.5 centimeters. That's about 1/3 of an inch. 1.5 centimeters. Well, about a centimeter. 1.5 centimeters. I found mostly penetration holes in tanks that were 3/4 of an inch up to 3 inches in diameter. Very few that were less than that. Most of them were this size. There are no weapons in the U.S. or the British or Australian arsenal officially rated or made out of depleted uranium of these diameters. Okay, there's an example. That's actually only about 1/2 inch in diameter, these on the ground here.
Yes, the effects are known medically, they are known scientifically. If somebody chooses not to make those, chooses to deny those, or actually to obfuscate by making up other science, or chooses to lie about it and say that's not harmful, then I disagree with them. If that's the U.S. Defense Department, then I disagree with it. If that's the uranium industry, then I disagree with it.
The Afghans don't have, most of the buildings in Afghanistan are made out of concrete, and you can see this is one. Now the concrete floors, there's 2 floors, and then there was a roof, which was probably steel, corrugated steel roof, and then there was a concrete slab. The bunker buster that hit this building, which is a radio station in what's called Yakutsk, which is a suburb of Kabul, went about 16 to 18 feet through the slab of the building and into the solid ground underneath, and then exploded. Just like the one I talked about in the film, went through, actually I said 6 stories in the film, it was 8 stories. 8 stories, 8 slabs of concrete, through 2 basement slabs, and underneath that, and then exploded after it reached that depth in the ground. The question was for us, what is capable of carrying a weapon or a warhead without just being destroyed? Because the impact, and the bunker busters are coming in at about 2.5 to 3 miles a second. What is keeping those from totally disintegrating when they hit multiple layers of concrete before, and then hit the ground, then go down 10, 12, 16 feet into the earth, and then explode? How could anything survive that shock? So this was only explained now. Every place where we found this bombs being used like this that made this depth of penetration, we found not depleted uranium contamination, we found natural uranium contamination. In other words, the bomb material, making materials were not DU, they were NU. They were pure uranium that hadn't been through the uranium enrichment process. They weren't. So there's a stream of bomb making out of uranium, using uranium metals, that does not go through the nuclear fuel cycle, that goes directly from mining and milling and refining into bomb making. It has, we found this you can go on now in Afghanistan and in Baghdad. And I'm taking a lot of pressure from a lot of people, particularly in the United States, mostly activists who say this Weman is crazy, this can't the United States and Britain would never use natural uranium, they only use DU, and they don't know what they're talking about at UMRC. Well, we can't fudge the laboratory results. The lab studies are done at the University of Frankfurt's Petroleum Research Institute with a $2 million piece of equipment. We don't have control over what it is. The previous studies from Afghanistan were done at the British Geological Survey Laboratory in England. We don't have control. We give them the samples. We say, please set your instruments to look for these things, and they do it. It costs us $1,000 each time one sample is analyzed, whether it's soil, water, or a human sample. Well, we don't have time to wait. We can't afford to waste the money just playing around. We have to be very careful about what we send and be very focused. And we find that we have 2 types of uranium being used both in Afghanistan and in Iraq.
Well, if you look at the immediately after the cessation of shock and awe campaign, and George Bush announced that they had taken Iraq, the U.S. troops, or actually the Australians, mostly it was Australians, British, and Americans had taken Iraq. Immediately the reports of the health conditions of the troops that were serving there were resembling Gulf War syndrome, immediately. And those reports were consistent whenever there was coverage. This time round, there has been pretty well a clampdown on any health deployment information getting out to the public. They've pretty well stopped anything from getting out. And they've replaced that with basically announcing they have uranium contamination and diagnostic programs. And if anybody thinks they might be ill, they can get from uranium, they can get it analyzed. But there has been no public release of public information this time round, this war, like there was after Gulf War I. So,
symptoms are very extensive. Here's an example of them. Bloody nose, and this is immediately after being exposed to these weapons, particularly the bunker busters. Bleeding nose and running nose, and actually the whole bleeding from the mouth and all the respiratory or the nasal area passages, chest pain and coughing, burning sensation, throat, nose, lips, and these eye irritations, rashes and skin irritation, hyperthermia, skin hypothermia, which is overheating of the skin, like a hot flushes on the skin, dry cough, gastric and intestinal alterations, and diarrhea. You get people actually presenting like they have flu. And that happens, these symptoms happen almost within minutes of the inhalation, and they being inundated with the cloud of the dust, and then the diarrhea and the gastric problems start that evening, and then they peak out the next day or two. People then have like a kind of a cold flu symptom for 2 to 3 weeks, and they seem to be okay. In fact, in Afghanistan, many people said, oh, this is just a symptom of this disease or that disease. We've had this many times. And then a few months later, these things start to happen. And men start saying, I can't get up. I'm just too tired. I can't work anymore. You know, mothers aren't interested in their children. And you get this neurological problems where entire families and communities lose their motivation to work. Now this seems like, and this is probably why Gulf War illness was called malingering. Because you malinger. You lose your motivation. You become exhausted. I tell you, when I get these problems and they come in waves, I don't want to do anything. I just want to stay in bed. I just want to sleep. And so these are physiological problems that occur, and all kinds of things happen. And you know, it affects everybody a little bit differently. After several years, you get you may have kidney problems, or the kidneys are pretty tough. They may actually repair themselves. There are long-term sexual dysfunctions and miscarriages, birth defects. And we saw kids there in Afghanistan that were lethargic and just were not. They weren't developing. They didn't have the kind of energy. They weren't typical of children with desire to eat or desire for attention. They were lethargic. And this village had what they called Arab compounds around, and it was targeted pretty heavily by fighter bombers, by F-18s or F-16s. This is one graph showing 8 people's uranium levels excreted in their uranium. The normal levels for an average person are 4 to 10. 4.0 to 10.0, basically. Look at these numbers. 88 up to 477. It doesn't come from any other source. You have to inhale it. You could not get these levels if you ate it. Because when you eat it, it goes through the gastrointestinal system and out and collects in your feces and is eliminated. You can only get these levels if you inhale it, because it's the inhalation that goes from the lungs into the bloodstream, and the kidneys clean the bloodstream, and you urinate it. So, people, when they say, oh, they live in an area highly naturally contaminated by uranium and they're eating it in their food, well, that's just not true. And this is one of the misinformation being given by the both governments involved in using these weapons. You can't get these increased levels by eating it. You can only get it by inhaling it. So it's very important to understand the metabolic pathway of uranium that is a problem is inhalation. And when you inhale it, a lot of it excretes immediately. My levels have gone down, way down. I'm down to like 4. Where I was 46 when I first came back. I'm 4, which is normal, but it still shows depleted uranium in my urine, even though it's been a couple of years since I was there. We have U.S. and Canadian and British veterans who are showing 12 years from the point of exposure, still showing depleted uranium as a small percentage of what's coming out of their urine. This one, actually, this is one boy who lived very close to that radio station in what's called Yucca 2. Was it Yucca 2? Yeah, Yucca 2 radio station. And he had 2,000 nanograms of uranium being excreted in his urine. He was walking home from, everybody goes to prayers there in the morning, or the fathers and the boys often do. They leave the house, they go to the local mosque, and there's one in every neighborhood. Literally on every block, so to speak. They walk back home. They're walking back home. This is just before sunrise, just before sunrise. So the sun hasn't broken, but there's still some light. Up on the hill above them is a radar station. The radar station is a metal radar, installment. Was not operable. An errant rocket missed the radar station or clipped the side of it, and tumbled down along this steep pathway down this very steep hill, and went and hit this young boy's house. He was maybe 200 yards from it. He could see it with his father walking along, and killed his mother and his two brothers. And he'd been living. They rebuilt the house on the spot, and they're living in the same location. And his uranium levels, 2,000. I mean, if normal is 10. That's a lot. That's very high. I mean, that's just extraordinary. That's unheard of levels. You don't find this in the uranium processing industry, amongst miners, amongst workers. It's unheard of to have this level of uranium being excreted in your urine. Okay, let's go on. Now okay. USA average, Gulf War veterans. Now here's an interesting figure. The second one, 1.3. Average of Gulf War veterans that we studied 9 years after exposure. What explains such low levels? Even though they had DU in their urine, their levels were huge, extremely low. Kidney dysfunction. When the kidney is damaged, it's not efficient at removing the toxins. So what we get is the opposite effect after a decade or 6 years to a decade later. You get reduced levels of all toxins being eliminated. Okay, UK control, that was 11. That was actually it was the daughter of one of the lab tech that did the work. The Afghan controls, that was the normal people who live now. Those are still high, 32. And then we have the average from Afghanistan and trip 1 and average from trip 2. So you just pretty dramatic effects.
Symptoms of uranium internal contamination are called nonspecific. In other words, if you're contaminated with uranium, you will show a range of symptoms that are similar to symptoms of several other diseases or several other causes. Therefore, it's easy to say we can't be specific that that problem came from uranium. That's the number one problem. So in terms of, it's easy for opposing physicians, government scientists to say, you can't say conclusively that that's from uranium, because it could have come from another particular disease for that person picked up, or another particular environmental origin. So that's one of the main problems. But that's the technical problem. The main issue in the failure of the society at large, or the medical community at large, to recognize uranium internal contamination is that there is no instruction in any medical school in any Western nation in uranium contamination and its effects. Anywhere. It's non-existent, it is not in the program, and it is not allowed to be taught in any universities anywhere.
This is Karay's water coming off the mountains in Afghanistan. This water source is from Tora Bora. This water is the melt water coming off the Tora Bora highlands, coming down through and then coming out the end of the sources on the flats below about 10 miles from Tora Bora. That water is all contaminated, coming out from Tora Bora. This was the public marketplace in downtown Baghdad. This is like going to the farmer's market. And it really is a farmer's market. And you get any fresh vegetables, meat, or fish, or whatever you wanted there. I don't know why this was targeted. I mean, nothing there except people selling it was a food market. This very good high-quality concrete work, but I'm going down into this is where the bunker buster penetrated and exploded, trying to get samples out of this marketplace. We crossed the country from Baghdad down to Basra and back. We went down one side and up the other, and then back again a week later to collect our samples.
You only know a thing by its presence and not by its absence. In the case of uranium weapons, the propaganda machine, the misinformation machine, has been very effective. Someone asked a question during my presentation about comparing nuclear bombs to depleted uranium penetrators. Well, as I said in my answer, there's been more mass of radioactive materials put into the environment by US, British, and Canadian use of depleted uranium than there ever was put in the environment by weapons testing of nuclear bombs. So it only makes sense that they've given it's become ubiquitous, and therefore it's it's important by that definition. The fact that the defense departments and pretty well all government agencies and government-funded private sector agencies, universities, laboratories, and research facilities pretty well have lined up on the government's side to say low-level radioactive emitters like uranium are not really that serious, but they're very good for making penetrators to destroy tanks and to make bunker busters, so we're going to keep using them. Well, the evidence is clear. The low-level emitters are toxic and they are also carcinogenic. But for some reason they've been able to sustain the criticism. So there isn't enough, perhaps enough knowledge about it.
You see the holes in the road? This is a road. It's an asphalt surface. Yeah, and you saw the picture of the Warthog or Thunderbolt. Each one of these is a DU round. That's a house over there. Now to the right, which you can't see, is another house. To the right, when I went in there with my translator and Dr. Shakely, who was an Arab, or was an Iraqi, so they welcomed us in. That had gone right through their property. You can imagine the impact it would do that to a tank. It's a non-explosive weapon. Think of that. No explosion. Simply high velocity impact of a very dense material is doing this to the tank. Okay, there's another one. They blew the turrets right off the tanks. Okay, there's some of the instruments we used. A typical Geiger counter on the left with the red buttons on it. And then that's called a multi-channel analyzer with the handle on it. That tells you what nuclides or what you have, and then stuck in the hole in the tank up there is this frisking probe that we used to check. Okay, let's go on to the next one. There's me like an idiot inside a contaminated tank without any protection equipment on, holding my mouth shut, trying not to breathe. I understand people can say you're a fool to have gone there without protection. You can't go into a community, and there's people everywhere, with masks on and suits on and equipment and say, can I please talk to you about where you were at the time? Were you exposed to these bombs? These people are exposed themselves. I'm not about to go in. They're living there every day. It would be impossible. Think about it. Walking up to someone's house and knocking on the door and saying, can I talk to you? You're living in a contaminated area and I'm all covered in masks. And you have to use a positive pressure mask. No regular white mask that you get in any drugstore or hardware store, or you get even a high-end mask used when the SARS epidemic, if you remember that, came out. None of that works. You have to use a positive pressure mask, carry a power pack, and it constantly forces pressure in your mask to allow nothing to get in. Besides the fact that there was no place to recharge my batteries if I had one, how can you go and interview people like that and talk to them about what we've just done to you like that? So that's why I didn't do it. So I paid for it, but that's just the facts.
Don't do as I do, do as I say. One should not go messing around in tanks hit by DU penetrators looking for signs of depleted uranium. I did that without protection. But as I said to the audience, I could not go into a foreign country where my country is just involved in invading and bombing it with masks and suits on and look like someone from out of a spaceship coming in to interview them and to talk to them about their health and their families and what they've just been through. So I had to make a decision, and I made the decision that I was not going to wear any protection. And as I said to the audience also, the regular masks that you saw other people use in that film, those are useless. They do not protect you. We're talking about 0.2, 0.1 micron diameter particles. They go through those masks, and they go through around the edges and in. You have to use a positive pressure equipment. The British sent a research team into Abu Qasib outside of Basra, where we found. After our results were public in London, and they got coverage in England, right, in 2003, they sent a team in, and they went in with these positive pressure masks and head coverings and completely sealed bodysuits and so on. And of course, nobody wanted to have anything to do with them. And the Americans did the same thing, American Army. We just, you don't get any connection, you don't get any facts, you don't get any truth, and you don't make any connection with the people. Now, you asked a question about the ceramicized. All uranium that has been processed over 400 or 500 degrees temperature is ceramic uranium. So whether it's the uranium going into the fuel bundle in the nuclear power plant up the lake, or whether it's uranium going into the DU penetrator being fired in Afghanistan, it's all ceramic uranium. And when you, if it, in its process of impact, explosion, burning, it reaches temperatures of 400 or 500 degrees, which it does. It reaches temperatures of up to 10,000 degrees. When something impacts at the velocity that those penetrators hit a tank, the immediate temperature, it reaches 8,000 to 10,000 degrees, just instantaneously. It's all ceramic uranium. Now, the material could be pure or it could be compound. It because at those temperatures it can fuse with anything else in its environment. So the answer to your question, is that what I have? Yes. Anybody who's exposed to those weapons will, and when the material aerosolizes, it auto-ignites. When it burns, it forms a ceramic shell. It becomes very hard and dense, and becomes low to no in solubility, and low soluble uranium in the body, in the lungs, stays there for a long time. It doesn't leave the lungs very quickly, and it will go into the lymph glands because it can't be cleared across the lungs. It will stay in the lymph glands basically permanently, and it will be found there in an autopsy in the person's body after they die. And it will be found in their grave 10,000 years later in the same exact location. If it solubilizes, or if the particles are small enough, then it will go across the lungs into the bloodstream. In the bloodstream, it will then be transported through the body, and if the particles are small enough, then they can be pulled out of the bloodstream by the kidneys, and they can be excreted in the urine. But a certain portion will recycle in the blood. It'll move through the body and course through the body, and it will be picked up by certain organs. And uranium is an unusual feature. It's called a bone seeker. It's not what you want to have in your blood, because it actually is attracted to the bone. The bone draws it in and replaces calcium with uranium. That's a very serious phenomena in which that metabolic process of blood-enriched uranium will actually become incorporated into the bones of anybody who happens to be contaminated, and it will replace calcium, and it will sit there and irradiate, and it will damage stem cells. Those stem cells leave the bone. They go out into the blood, they go to different parts of the body to replace and renew the cellular structures in the body, and they will be mutated by having been influenced or accosted by the uranium that went into the bones in the first place. Over a period of years, the body will release that uranium. It's called decorporation, and that uranium from the bones will go back into the blood and be carried somewhere else. Or it will be picked up again by the kidneys, and that portion will be eliminated. And that cycle of incorporation, decorporation, solubilizing, going into the blood, or non-solubilizing, going into the lymph, is what goes on. That's why we're finding it, ceramic uranium, in the blood, or rather in the urine of people 10 years after exposure, and can expect to find it in their bodies in 30, 40, 50 years, or in their autopsies.
There's another hole that makes no sense and doesn't fit the specifications of any U.S., British, or Australian round admitted to be in existence at all or ever in history. My point is there's several types of rounds, both explosive and non-explosive, that have not ever been admitted to be manufactured or deployed. Yeah. Okay. Everybody knows about Asamawa. That's where the Dutch had left because it was contaminated. They took over from the U.S. troops there, and the Japanese had a big, almost the Prime Minister of Japan almost lost his job because he sent troops there, and they went in with their Geiger counters, and the place they were supposed to bunk up, which was an old warehouse, was so contaminated the troops refused to go. This is the guys from the 442nd in New York State who returned from Asamawa. There's a picture they took inside their own when they were being deployed. Let's continue. These are American citizens who are now veterans of Gulf War II or Operation Iraqi Freedom. Okay, so as you may have heard or may not have heard, there was quite a high-profile story last year in which the New York Daily News funded the research because none of them could pay for it themselves. It's just too expensive. It's $1,000. It's 1,000 euros actually, which is about $1,400 US. And these guys were in a Samoa, and they mostly Hispanics who from outside of New York City, and they, as you saw, about half of them were contaminated. So this is the most recent sort of U.S. results we have. We have lots of results from elsewhere. We just got fresh results back showing people contaminated with enriched uranium from Iraq, which we don't know what to do with because it's totally an anomaly. We don't know what that means. Where do you get enriched uranium? In the urine of people who've been in Iraq, who were serving as non-governmental aid, NGO staff in Iraq and so on. We've got people with very high concentrations of natural uranium. And of course, we've got uranium-236, which is an artificial isotope which only exists because human beings make it in all of these samples that come from Iraq and from Afghanistan. Not in any of the control samples we took from areas that were not bombed.
Could I compare this maybe to other issues of health or social issues in the world? I think probably I have to say I believe this one stands pretty high in terms of importance, or so we say criticality, because uranium contamination or nuclear materials contamination is a very serious matter on a worldwide scale. It is the West, Canada, the U.S. in particular, that originated this industry and it's now become a weapon, conventional weapon as well. And so I guess I feel maybe some sense of responsibility as well, or coming from these countries. I would consider the use of uranium in non-fissile penetrating weapons and bunker busters, whether they contain high explosives or not, to be effectively a nuclear weapon, because it is dispersing nuclear materials, radioactive nuclear materials. It is effectively no different than a fissile or nuclear bomb. The only difference is one is a massive explosion, the other one is a small explosion. Otherwise, both disperse radioactive materials across the Earth. And as I said in my presentation, depleted and non-depleted uranium conventional weapons have put more radioactive material in the environment than nuclear weapons. It's known, even if it's known secretly, so to speak, or let's say quietly or tacitly on a worldwide scale, that these things have got long-term implications no one wants to face. If you don't have a moral objection, you might have a pragmatic objection, which might be the liabilities that a nation faces for permanently contaminating another nation's environment. Saddam Hussein was a short-lived event, but uranium contamination in Iraq will last for millions of years.